Welcome back to the Zeitcast, where we discuss the intersections of spirituality and culture, theology and culture. I'm so excited about this conversation. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my new friend, Dr. Jared Stacy. And before I go on and embarrass you, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this
Yeah.
while I'm on the road and I feel like I'm chaos.
No, man, thank you for having me. Technology is incredible. This is why we do what we do, is getting to sit down like this real quick. And it's a time, you're right. It's like a really timely conversation,
Yeah,
and we don't want to postpone. We're less than 2 weeks out of something that we don't know how long it will last with the election and the
indeed.
aftermath.
Indeed.
And so these kind of conversations are necessary, and I'm glad that we can do this on such short notice.
Well, I'm honored that you would do it. So Jared's a theologian, ethicist. So I'll set it this way because this is just the honest story. So
Sure.
I think we followed each other for a while on what I will forever call Twitter, and
Yeah.
so I was aware of you and very much like this. Oh yeah, like he's a thoughtful guy, and kind of the sense of like, oh, we're generally in the same lane. Like his stuff's good. Like, oh yeah, seems like great. Here's what I did not know because. And I won't get into all that. I mean, I've had the last few years my own critiques of Christian nationalism,
Right.
had a bit of a skirmish with Jerry Falwell Jr., some stuff like that. I have up until fairly recently, haven't really thought so much specifically or used language specifically of misinformation and disinformation.
Hmm.
And suddenly I felt like I'm surrounded with it and I'm
Right.
hearing pastors preach, Trump's talking points on FEMA and all that in North Carolina and like all this stuff. And my friend that you just heard the conversation, Lauren, who is just to me, just a spirit-led
Hmm.
person. She was going to record with me, and she texted me like, I really feel like we should talk about disinformation, which Nicole and I just saying, man, I think we need to do a week on like disinformation. It's
Yeah.
all while this stuff is happening within like a week or two that for whatever reason, I know the phone is, I'm sure, listening to everything, but I'm not to be conspiratorial, but it's like I kind of have this sense of like you're coming at my feed, and I'm like, wait a second, wait, Jared, not just Christian nationalism, you're doing scholarly work on evangelicals and misinformation and
Yeah.
disinformation specifically, and
Yeah.
it just blew my brain open because I don't know anybody else who is doing this work. And I'll say more about this as we go. But hearing you say things that like I know that they're happening, but I haven't been able to find language for. And I'm
Right.
asking people all the time. So what is this phenomenon exactly? And you're speaking to it with such specificity and such clarity. Where I'm like, I have to have a conversation with Jared. So all to say, thank you for your work
Good.
and thank you so much for making this time.
Oh, of course. I'm glad to hear that too. I mean, the misinformation and disinformation are almost risk kind of becoming white Christian nationalism, where it's so overloaded in the zeitgeist
Yeah.
that we kind of forget to use definitions for it, and it can
Mm,
become very reactive. And so, yeah, I think, and you kind of brought this up, but the specificity of my research and trying to name these things arises from just my own story. Like
yeah.
Steinbeck always said that the universal is found in the particular,
Mm,
and so I lead often with, like, I was a pastor for 10 years. I went to Liberty, and
mm,
so I can't tell my story without talking about the influence of what I would have just called Christianity, which
mm.
now we kind of have different language to talk about white Christian nationalism. And that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's helpful for listeners too, to listening to us talk about this, to realize the
Yeah.
perspective as a scholar that I'm
Yeah.
coming from is actually formed from just really normal, maybe deep experience inside white evangelicalism,
Mm,
with a tinge of fundamentalism for
yeah.
me. And so it's all emerging from my story. And I didn't actually set out to do my PhD in conspiracism.
Mm,
That was something that in conversations with my supervisors, it became really apparent that conspiracism, misinformation, disinformation was obviously a topic of concern, like social concern, but it was also a very specific window into the Christianity that I've deeply been shaped by.
mm,
Um, and so it proved to be critical and constructive, and in some really helpful, and I hope provocative ways.
yeah.
we can get into that a little bit, but that's just my background that I think can be helpful to kind of let
Well,
people know
and
about.
I actually did want to start with you talking a bit about your story in that way, because one of the things I think is important about what you're doing, and this would be true of any movement, as helpful as outside critique is, it's
Yeah.
very different when a random sociologist or like a scientist studying something in the lab versus
Yeah.
product of the church, pastor, practitioner, deep love for the church in ministry, where you start to see these things that you can't ignore, that you can't
Right.
deny. But this not coming from because I just happened to go to an Ivy League school and decided I'm not into the Bible and Jesus
Yeah.
and I'm trying to be hard on the Christians. Like, no, this is a journey clearly born out of love for the church and attempt to be faithful to your own calling. So yeah, I would love for you to share just a bit of your
Sure.
story in terms of how you got here.
Yeah, it was a slow drip. And I've described it almost as saying like I was converted. Part of my conversion as a Christian is conversion out of Christianity, out of a particular form of Christianity. And so, for listeners who like kind of want, where does that kind of language come from? There's a guy called Kierkegaard. If you just kind of Soren might be a good way to Soren K, and then if you put that into Google, you'll get a whole host of. He was a 19th century philosopher and theologian who really wrestled and struggled with cultural Christianity. He was talking about the Bible Belt in Denmark before we were talking about the Bible Belt in the American South. So he kind of gave me the language to talk about that. But I was raised in a broadly fundamentalist Baptist church, and I can talk about that in a good sense, and I can talk about that in the bounded sense of there were also impulses within American fundamentalism and evangelicalism that shaped my reception of the faith too. And so I like to describe it as it's an entanglement that we're always trying to disentangle, and not that we can ever rid ourselves from the specific realities of what it is to be embodied people. Like I was raised in Tampa Bay, Florida. Like I went to a particular church. I went to a particular school. And so to kind of bring that full circle and give people an idea of what I'm talking about, and this is going to be kind of how my brain works. If someone's brain doesn't work like this, I'm sorry. But to wrap up with Kierkegaard again, he was a 19th century Danish philosopher theologian. Now, if you fast forward into the 20th century during World War II, at the end of World War II, there was a strategy by Japan called the kamikaze attacks. And what they would do is they would recruit young men from institutions like colleges. These were the educated men who had not made it into the war draft yet, and sign them up to be kamikaze pilots. So planes that would crash, intentionally drive themselves into American targets. And I heard a story about a kamikaze pilot, and we tend a long way away from this kind of conversation. We tend to focus on maybe the ideology of the Japanese military, of what motivated these men to get in these cockpits and do this. I heard a story recently about a kamikaze pilot who actually had a copy of Kierkegaard, this Western Danish philosopher, with him in his cockpit. And it struck me as so particular, so concrete, that it seemed to like defy a lot of the assumptions that we just broadly paint. And I thought in some ways too, that's the tension that I feel as someone who comes out of white evangelicalism, who's also critiquing it, is like this kamikaze with Kierkegaard. That's not a normal association that people make with Imperial Japan and the end of World War II. And to bring that analogy home in a lot of ways, it's reminded me that white evangelicalism has and carries forward a lot of dangerous impulses theologically, politically, and at the same time, we have to be, and I think Christianity and the Christian faith helps us do this. We have to be attentive to the particularity of human beings, and that each person that we meet has a particular story. And so I feel like it's my task to talk about the complexity of growing up in fundamentalism, of hearing racist and Islamophobic sermons after 9/11 that were kind of my first memory of hearing disinformation and conspiracy bound up in the Christian story. But then as I went through, I mean, this was something that was just very normal. And it wasn't abnormal until it became like acute, until it became a crisis. And so for a lot of people, right, that was 2016, that was 2017. I was pastoring in the Bible Belt. And even then, like, there was just the sense that conspiracy theories are just something that your uncle believes, and that's a trope. but
Yeah.
it was kind of true. Like the JFK assassination and all those sorts of, those beliefs could be had. They were maybe even interesting, but they weren't affecting the social world
Sure.
like it was until we start looking at, even before 2016, at Ferguson in 2014, everything that kind of was lit on fire in American society, that our digital algorithm sort of amplifies and accelerates. And so what I noticed, to kind of bring it all together, is that oftentimes I noticed as a pastor that the Christian story was used as propellant for disinformation, and that the people who I was pastoring, and there was a generational divide. There was older people who were really caught up in this back in 2020. Now it's much more spread out. I don't
Yeah.
see as much of a generational split as I was in the early times. There's some reasons for that. But back in 2020, there was a lot of disinformation that was kind of supercharged by this telling of the Christian story. And what I found was the young adults that I was pastoring, and there was this crisis, this moment of decision of like, do I have to follow this Jesus down this road of basically, Republican adjacent conspiracy theories that in so many ways kind of attached themselves to and propped up the ascendancy of Donald Trump and MAGA Christianity. And so it became really important for me, and to kind of recognize that this whole problem of disinformation and conspiracy theory has a long history, that isn't just confined to Donald Trump, but we all feel it because of where we're living right now. And so what my research does, it kind of is born out of being inside white evangelicalism, but it goes back into the history of evangelicalism across the United States, across like 300 years. But really to say something very specific about right now, which is that the Christian story does not give you the ability to see behind closed doors. It doesn't grant you omniscience. And it also doesn't grant you gnosis. It doesn't grant you like this kind of secret insider knowledge. Like, so we have to contend with that at two different levels. So I know that's a lot, but I tried to kind of narrate, hey, this is my journey as a pastor, but also as a kid, like growing up in this and not being able to tell the difference between it, to what I recognized as a pastor, and then how that kind of fueled my research into a very particular set of kind of where to put my feet that I hope proves generative, as we keep talking.
Yes. Oh, not too much at all. And I love that when you describe the slow drip, and even the earliest experiences of hearing conspiracy theories in church post 9/11, 2014, Ferguson, some things start ramping. Was there a particular breaking point for you where it's like, where it went from, this is a thing that I notice, to an emergency that kind of changed the trajectory of your life? Was there a moment for that? A kind of crisis moment, since we're good evangelicals?
Yes and no. I think probably the best way to put it is to use like clinical language of saying like there was a chronic condition that manifested in like acute crisis symptoms. That my unsettledness with the deposit of faith that I had been given kind of really began in earnest in New Orleans, where I was, for the first time, I was going to church with people who would say like, I'm a Democrat. I was going to church with, it wasn't all white. Like it was African Americans, it was Hispanics. It was a totally different socioeconomic community that I was a part of. And so that kind of experience sort of inoculated me for going back into the Bible Belt, but I also was a product of the Bible Belt and that kind of insular faith. And so it was very much a slow drip that maybe had like flashpoints. I remember going to a prayer, it was called a prayer rally, but at the time it was, I don't know if you remember the name Bobby Jindal. He was a Republican candidate. Yeah. So he was, before kind of Trump's ascendancy, Bobby Jindal was kind of testing his candidacy with evangelicals. And I went to a prayer rally. I thought was a prayer rally as a pastor, and there was prayer, but it in many ways we could probably say, looking back, that it was kind of a what became Trump rallies. That Republican candidates always used to stump that way, to tell their testimony and to have local church leaders there, and it was very much a part of the white evangelical political right. And Trump's rallies are a continuation of that. They didn't come out of nowhere. The legacy of Billy Graham's revivals is right there in our faces every time a Trump rally happens. So there was some unsettledness there, but I think the the most unsettling, maybe in a chronic sense for me, was actually reading Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise.
Yeah.
And when I started to recognize that, I didn't know much about Christian history in America, but I love American history. I didn't know much about church history in America, and that exposed me to the fact that maybe the unsettling question that maybe the faith that I've inherited has not been honest about its history and has not done that work. Because what Dr. Tisby presented, I think, so well was that racism and injustice is never eradicated; it evolves.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really shocking moment for me, and really unsettling and a ruining in the best way possible. So that when 2020 happened, kind of when you're given the resources and the content from Tisby's book and other histories to kind of be able to suggest, like, hey, our reaction as white evangelicals to Trump's ascendancy, to protests against racial injustice and police brutality, like all of the responses and the playbooks that were in white churches at the time had been honed for hundreds of years. And so the acute kind of crisis moments were there, but they were in so many ways connected to this almost, I mean, we talked about New Orleans before we got on, and it's almost like gumbo, like gumbo, you put a bunch of stuff in the pot and you just let it simmer. That's what it was for me. And until there was a clear, like, okay, we need to leave, we need to get out. And that happened. But it was the product of years of patient people, putting pebbles in our shoe and walking alongside of us and letting me ask questions and letting me be wrong. People who are really gracious in that way. So convoluted, I think, but yeah, the chronic and the acute both came together. And I think, like with a lot of people, 2020 just proved very, it was just a crisis defining moment. And for us, that meant we went to Scotland for the last 3 years. And that was an education in and of itself, getting outside America. And I'll just wrap that little portion up by saying that I think one of the things about living outside the United States and doing theological work and worshiping outside the United States is realizing that the theologies that have emerged from the global church, particularly in the South, and so theologies that emerged from outside America and theologies that emerged from beneath America, so Black theology, have always spoken about the American situation with such clarity that a lot of the things that I was trying to do as a white evangelical, I was using the language of white evangelicalism to do it. But there's other theologies that have long contended against that kind of alliance between Christianity and empire. And so I think that was bracing in the sense of, it's a very American notion to feel like I'm going to fix America. I'm going to fix American evangelicalism. But when you start to swim in the theological currents of those who are oppressed, those who have emerged from beneath America or outside of it with clarity, then you kind of realize your job is not to maybe lead so much as it is to listen. And so in this way, my work as disinformation and conspiracy theory is particularly designed and to be addressed to, in so many words, like those who have privilege and power, those whose Christianity is kind of built upon the notion that our social order, if our social order were to collapse, our Christianity would collapse with it. And that's what is kind of theologically going on at the base of some of these conspiracy theories.
Ooh, wow, that's so strong. I love this so much here because I resonate with everything from one, my own experience of growing up in the Pentecostal church meant there was always a certain proximity to the Black church that just became more profound. And it's like the more I went down the trail, the more I'm listening to those voices that were already very much in the gumbo, like for my culture. The more I took that seriously, the more it became like ultimately that's been it for me. Not, people like, oh, everything's about race. Well, not everything, but an awful lot of things are once you come to see. And I feel like sitting at the feet of a lot of the luminaries in that world and just kind of listening and learning, that's what broke me open. That's what changed everything. Fascinating too, because I feel like white evangelicalism, one of the most defining things for me is this strange notion that what we do, if you're in the white evangelical movement, is whiteness as like vanilla, bland, culture free. Everyone else is enculturated. Everybody else has a
Yeah.
culture except for us.
Right.
Well, we just read the Bible. We're just doing what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Everybody else, I've heard preachers say, it's like, well, you come to Jesus, it's not about Russian culture. It's not about like Ukrainian culture. It's not like whatever. Like your
Yeah.
culture is Jesus, and there really is this idea that like, oh, our culture is just Jesus.
Right.
Everybody else has a culture.
Right.
So on white evangelicalism, I did want to specific because I love that I feel like you lean into this a good bit. I did want to ask you to define a couple terms specifically in terms
Sure.
of what misinformation is to you,
Yeah.
disinformation, and maybe even white evangelicalism, just because, well, most people who listen are going to be more or less in the same train, and there's a lot of us kind of disillusioned disciples that
Yeah.
have kind of come out of that world. But I still get pushback sometimes from people that are kind of more like, no, wait a second. Well, I'm white and I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, I'm a white evangelical. What's
Right.
wrong with that? Why does that sound pejorative? So I just love it. Maybe misinformation, disinformation, white evangelicalism. If you talk about what you mean when you use those words.
Yeah. So misinformation and disinformation, I'm going to give these definitions that distinguish them, but I want to start by saying they overlap. One person's misinformation can be another person's disinformation. And the difference is misinformation I would define as faulty information that is shared, believed, amplified in ignorance. So faulty information. Now my sense in using faulty is just simply because, well, maybe it's just you don't have all the information. Maybe it could be wrong for a variety of reasons that we could basically attribute just to ignorance. That someone lacks the categories to think differently. So faulty information that can be rectified. But then there's disinformation that is false information that is amplified with malice and intent. And so you could see then how one person can receive disinformation kind of as misinformation, right? That for them, it's functioning as just faulty information that I'm going to share in ignorance.
Yeah.
But if you look at the way that, again, and this kind of gets in the geopolitical, that Russia, China, also kind of we're into this realm of kind of rogue barons like Musk, who are propagating disinformation for their own anti-democratic ends. A great example of this is the Haitian community kind of being marginalized for the eating pets reality, that kind of claim. I think some people shared that as misinformation. Like, I think this is true. Like, I'm not really sure. And they had even the woman who made the call, like, apologized for it and said, like, oh,
right.
my cat was in my basement. I'm so sorry. But those who then took that and spread it, sowed it intentionally, J.D. Vance, Trump campaign in general, that's disinformation. And then I'll kind of end with this is just saying that the relationship between disinformation and propaganda also overlaps. I'll just leave it there. Evangelicalism is a whole nother podcast, and I really
sure.
what I want to do really simply is the evangelical label is something that has been fought about for a very long time. Yeah. And what I want to focus on is not so much defining it as it is raising the question of what's at stake in our attempts to define it. So I'll say that again. What I want to do is raise the question of not who is an evangelical, because I think the question of who is an evangelical is actually hiding another question, which is who gets to be an evangelical.
Wow. Yeah.
And what I'm really concerned about right now is that the evangelical label we can use kind of like a shelter. Like I'm the real evangelical.
Sure.
And what happens is in that kind of closes us off from, and this is now me using theological language, from a truly evangelical encounter, meaning an encounter with the God of Jesus Christ.
Wow.
And no effort to identify with this label, be it a theological scheme or be it, and I think we're at the point now of kind of saying like, yeah, evangelical as a theological scheme of maybe 20, 30 years ago has become a social scheme and it always has been. I'd make that case. But there's this effort, right, to a long running effort to define evangelical by like 4 beliefs: the cross, believing the Bible, believing in conversion, and in activism, like that your faith makes a difference in the world.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you put that, Daniel Silliman makes this case that when you try to apply that definition to history, it often doesn't really help you narrate why people do what they do. And so trying to apply that definition to Donald Trump and MAGA doesn't always kind of lead us into this conclusion of like, oh, well, of course this guy would have 80% of the white evangelical vote. And of course, those who contest that would say, well, how are you defining evangelical? So let me bring this home to a really practical point to illustrate why I'm more concerned about who gets to be an evangelical rather than what is an evangelical. Is that what's at stake in our ability to define evangelical is when I go to January 6th. So that's where I cashed out my research. It was at January 6th. And there was a Capitol police officer who gave in his testimony. His name was Daniel Hodges. And he testified to Congress. He said that it was clear that the terrorists perceived themselves to be Christians. That's what he said. Now, here's what's at stake. If someone says they're not real Christians or they're not real evangelicals, then all we're doing is no true Scotsman-ing ourselves out of responsibility. And so my contention is less who gets to be an evangelical and more, what does it mean to encounter the God of Jesus Christ? So I'm not against like theological schemes, but I am trying to resist letting a definition kind of count as enough to kind of enable us to pit one vision of purity against another. Mainly because I'm concerned that we hide behind it and we don't actually do the work of saying like, yeah, I identify with these people who've called themselves evangelical, but we also have a lot of issues inside the house that we need to deal with. And so like Gideon, who was like, God, I want you to free us from the oppressive Midianites. That's that kind of classic culture war framework of like, would you get rid of the people outside of us?
Yeah.
And God tells Gideon, hey, why don't you go tear down the Asherah pole that's in your dad's backyard? And Gideon's so afraid to do that he does it at night, which tells me that God was not going to bring deliverance while people had another God that they were worshiping, that they were going to give credit to that God for any kind of deliverance that he would offer. So if what evangelicalism confuses for its security and its power and its privilege, if that were to be taken away, that might be deliverance. But so long as Donald Trump kind of maintains this ascendant hold on what we might broadly conceive of as, just evangelicalism in America, the loss of power and privilege and that kind of social control will only be seen as a threat, not as deliverance. And that's, I think, what's at stake with something like January 6th and kind of all implied in that very good loaded question, like, what is an evangelical? And I love that. But it also sets us on this deeper theological path of like, what's at stake and who gets to define that? And that's a much more potent and unsettling question. And we might find if we were historians asking it or sociologists, which I'm in support of those kind of disciplines, but I think theology kind of generates a more provocative set of questions that is in the church's language.
Yeah. Well, I love the theological perspective that you bring, and which brings me, and all this is so, I mean, oh gosh, it's so helpful. I'm just drinking deeply from the whole thing, but the kind of, so for somebody like me that pays attention, reads a lot, but hasn't done deep dive on misinformation and disinformation, and yet I feel like, we're talking a lot about the same things. I imagine you get the question a lot, as do I. So if you are a person who believes that empire is real and empire is everywhere, and that no other social structures are identical to the kingdom or kingdom of God, et cetera, et cetera. Sure seems like you're talking a lot about Trump. Sure seems like you're talking a lot about January 6th. And why is it, when you're not obviously a Democratic Party operative or something, why is it that so much of the work focuses specifically there. I'm imagining you get that question a lot, like I get that question a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a really good. You know what? A credit to the University of Aberdeen, where I got my degree. That question came up in my dissertation defense.
Interesting.
So I think it's really valid. I think it's a really valid question. And I would answer it two ways. The first way is saying I'm directing my attention here because of my evangelical heritage. So we're dealing specifically with the narratives, the conspiracy theories, the beliefs that have organized white Christianity in America. So the particularity is important because you're dealing with a particular community.
Right.
But the second thing I would say, and this is kind of into the broader realm of just disinformation and misinformation, is precisely that conspiracism is not the birthright of the right on the political spectrum. So that was a confusing way to put that. What I'm trying to say is that conspiracy theory, disinformation, misinformation, the right does not own that. It shows up on the left, it shows up on the right. And what I'm very aware of is how conspiracy theory tends to be a left-coded term. That the right in America at least kind of prizes itself and being like, oh yeah, like if you're doing the work, like you're a conspiracy theorist, and that can be a credit to some people. And so there has to be a way, and there's scholarship out there to suggest this, and that does that. Conspiracism is not just an ideological reality, but it's very much a modern reality, that it's part of just our modern epistemological, like the way we know things and how we think we know things. And so it doesn't play just on the right, it's on the left too. And it really, what it boils down to, and this is where I think I'm excited about the theology behind this, is that conspiracism is just actually a very secure, very comforting way of continuing to narrate a very chaotic and very complex social and political world. That has nothing to do with political ideology. It has everything to do with the scale and the speed of information and what I'm kind of calling our digital info structure. So when we move from just kind of looking at screens, kind of like just in more of an innocent way of like, I'm thinking of all the evangelical sermons I heard growing up of like how to use your phone biblically, And I taught those sermons. Like I get it, but we're not thinking deep enough about the web of interface and infrastructure that is shaping human and directing human existence towards certain ends. And so disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theory are all part of a much bigger infrastructure that characterizes like our global human existence. So we're kind of not beyond the realm of ideology, but we're at this point of being able to recognize, and this is that second element of my question, is that conspiracy theory is everyone's problem. But if it's everyone's problem, in some cases it's no one's problem, which is why it brings me back to the first thing I said. It's like, I'm talking about conspiracy theory in not just in Christian community, but in a very particular community in the United States of America. And I think that particularity is helpful for talking about the big part of it that we all face. And so that's how I would kind of answer those two, because I think it's a legitimate question.
Jared, so helpful. And I mean, a lot of it for me, I know, is like this sense, well, one, when people explicitly co-opt the language and literature of your faith,
right?
I mean, people can say a lot of things I disagree with, but if they're not overtly co-opting the gospel that I love and cherish, I'd be like, well, I disagree with that. But it's pretty different when it becomes something that's idolatry. It's not incidental, by the way, that though a little silly, wearing this shirt today, that one is funny to me because The Exorcist 2 is objectively a garbage film. It's a terrible film, so I found that funny. But also the fact that sort of self-proclaiming heretic is fun, but more so this sense that, like, I really think this conversation has a lot to do with larger questions of evil and structural evil and principalities and powers and, who's the prince of the power of the air? It's kind of like it all feels very connected to me.
So what you're describing is exactly the research journey that I went on. Because there's this knee-jerk reaction that's earnest and well-meaning among Christians who kind of want to contend with disinformation to kind of just say this, and I've said it, and you probably have too, is like, why don't people just believe the facts?
Right. Sure.
And I said that very, like, the earliest type of activism that I could imagine is what we have right now, which is fact checking, which is, hey, how do we contend with each little claim on its own turf? Research shows that that doesn't work in dispelling and disrupting disinformation. But that's what we as modern people, like, we think facts build the world. We think facts build reality. And the thing about secularism as a very broad term, I'm not talking culture war term, I'm just talking as a way of talking about how modern people think. Secularism claims that it has no story.
Sure.
And that there's just raw scientific facts. But in saying that it has no story, and this is a little bit of Stanley Hauerwas, secularism claims that it has no story, and that is a story.
Yeah.
And so what theology can offer, especially as we kind of as Christians kind of say, why don't people believe in facts anymore? Well, our primal stories have not gone anywhere. Our ways of organizing fact and in investing it with meaning and saying these facts matter, these facts don't. There's a story in there that's doing that moral work to kind of move things around. And one of the things, and this kind of brings me to what you're talking about, is like that struggle of seeing your faith kind of co-opted. I think when we're pressed, a lot of us who have encountered it in personally in relationships. I mean, I listened to the podcast that you had with Lauren and her experience with disinformation, like at a family level. And that's the level where we have to stop kind of going on the intellectual exercise with this and realizing that like the work of theology and Christian community has always been about binding up wounds and been about making peace between people. And that's so while there's a lot of effort in our broader society to kind of solve this as like a technological problem, and it is technological, but at root, it's also a very human problem. And my point in raising all that about facts and story is really to suggest that for Christians to say, why don't people believe facts anymore? We have to recognize that in 2020, when I was contending with the stolen election claim, I didn't realize at the time that what I was really doing was I was implicating and causing a theological or faith crisis.
Wow.
You know, that for many people, because the way that they're narrating their world and conspiracy helps them do that, conspiracy theory, about the stolen election and things like that, that Jesus, their faith, was bound up in that. And what I've kind of, the language that I've kind of come to use and learn from others to talk about that is that there's a way to talk about, well, maybe your faith is getting hijacked by politics, but maybe a better way of talking about it is that your faith has become disoriented. That January 6th was a Christian event. That it is not enough for me to just say those aren't real Christians. It'd be easier.
Sure.
But there was prayer. There was a lot of prayer. And so that's a theological issue. And the easy way is to kind of look at that from a distant kind of religious perspective and say, let me break this apart, like from a scientific point of view. It's a whole nother thing to say, I'm going to contend with, we should contend with January 6th by the very story that was being invoked to cause it. And so that can be redemptive because it's like jujitsu, that you're absorbing that energy, but redirecting it in a way that sweeps the leg, that kind of takes out the ground that it's trying to stand on. And so the only way to sort of disrupt a paranoid, like split-minded portrait of Jesus is to recapture who Jesus says he is. And so, that's me preaching a little bit.
It's so good.
But to bring that full circle, like we all have this urge to kind of meet disinformation and misinformation on a facts alone basis. And I'm kind of here suggesting and inviting Christians to realize that reality is not, your concept of reality is not constructed by facts alone. And that the stories that we tell and we've been given, that oftentimes we just inhabit. We don't tell, we just inhabit. That those stories do go a long way in giving us what appears obvious, in encoding what is clear or what is biblical. And so long as we kind of live our lives in this speed that makes it painful, difficult,
Right.
costly to slow down, we'll never examine the stories that we often tell, which is why it brings me to this point. One of the conversations that you and I had early on was about something that I think I had said about how Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, persists even when pastors don't invoke the name of Trump.
Yes. Yes.
And so we're kind of to that point of that conversation, and that was my experience. Like, I didn't go to an overtly Christian nationalist church.
Yeah.
I didn't serve in places that were overt. Now, some people would say, if you saw the things that was normal, you'd say, yeah, that's Christian nationalism, or that's fusing God and country. Okay, that's true. But what we're talking about right now is a moment where pastors are naming the name Trump from the stage and things like that. I did not have that. It was a very thick piety that almost removed itself from politics.
Absolutely.
And so we can kind of go that direction too, if you want.
Oh, I'm so glad you went there, because it's literally going to be my next question. Because
Good.
the reason that lit me up so much, because it's weird how hard I feel like I've just struggled to find people to even be able to ask this question to, or maybe because my sense is, and this, of course, this is anecdotal, but kind of like your story. So
Yeah.
I know so many white evangelical people that still most of the people I would know in the world generally align themselves in some regard, like in those spaces. And at the end of the day, especially when people in ministry, I only know a handful. I know very few who talk just like Lance Wallnau or Rick Joyner or even Franklin Graham. Very, very, very few.
Yeah.
What I hear and see all the time, and I do mean all the time, certainly in Pentecostal charismatic circles, Trump's name rarely mentioned. Certainly not telling people to vote for him. Would even say expressly in the sermon, because you're coming down from Mount Sinai with it, well, we're not telling people this is holy. We're not bringing politics in the church. They're bringing politics in the church, which I'd also love for you to speak to. But the thing that is just so wild for me about it is that then they repeat every other talking point about everybody else, and except for Trump, and then take you all the way up to the water to just like, well, we're not telling you who to vote for, but, and like do all of that lifting without ever using his name. So there's still plausible deniability of, oh, we're not being political. They're the ones being political. So you just like speaking to that had me like just screaming, because I still feel like so many folks, when I try to push this a little bit, oh, well, no, that's not what I'm doing. I just care about abortion, whatever it might be. When it's like, no, literally the things that you heard from the campaign in the last 24 hours are on your social media and are in your sermon. So yeah, I would love for you to speak to what that cloaks, why it is so often that maybe, to me at least, the main artery looks more like that than it does a flag or a sticker.
And I think what I'm enjoying about this is that, like, you have to be there to see it.
That's
like,
right. Yes.
You have to live in it, and you have to have. For me, I had this, and I'm sure you have too, where you have a conversation where you have unknowingly transgressed, and this is kind of my way into this conversation, where I was confronted because I had crossed the line from what was moral to what was now political. And the piety that kind of allowed for the conversation about was moral or biblical, the piety covers that. But the piety doesn't cover what was unknowingly, unspeakably deemed political. And so the unsettlingness of that kind of conversation, I was told two things in that conversation that I want to remember for listeners. The first was, Jared, you know that Jesus is for small government, right? That's an ideological statement. That's not theological at all, but it was offered up as a theological statement.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
But the second thing was this. It was in the middle of 2020. And I don't want to cast myself as some kind of paragon for racial reconciliation, because I'm still very much learning about what is expected of me and what me as a white American Christian, what responsibility looks like from that standpoint. But the advocacy I was doing at the time was as a white pastor in a predominantly white upper middle class church. And so the conversation also went, well, you care about racism, I care about abortion, as if suddenly those two things were just kind of partisan issues. And one was deemed political, but the other was deemed moral. And so what we're, even in a more meta, like broader sense, this is going to get very niche, but if some of your listeners might remember and pick up with this, I don't expect people to follow. It was my world for a long time, but SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, kind of convention politics.
Yeah.
If in one of the conferences in 2022, I think, what was really big at that time was the idea of a rhino in Republican in name
Sure.
only. And that kind of partisan sentiment almost creeped in to the SBC convention as well. So when you're having like denominational politics that are kind of mirroring partisan politics and an expression of the same basic sentiments, but just kind of expressed in a denominational ecclesial setting, like you're really starting to see this interplay between partisan sentiment, partisan loyalty, and ecclesial practice. So, but at a local church level, I think two things that I would really bring up, and you've mentioned whiteness earlier, and I think it's actually helpful to return to it here because the idea of politics as being impure, the idea of politics as being, something that the church shouldn't be involved in or give itself to. I think one of the things that that legacy does come from is this very much this paternalism that whiteness sort of perpetuates of, and you mentioned it, if one of the questions I was asked that unsettled me into that awareness was someone asked, hey, can you describe Hispanic preaching to me? And so I said, oh, can you describe Black preaching? Okay. And he loved me. He goes, now describe white preaching. And I just kind of like stopped in my tracks because like I had absorbed that exactly what you're talking about. We don't have a culture. We just our culture is Jesus.
Right.
And so those kind of statements, I think, and you mentioned earlier why people who kind of would overhear this conversation say, why are we making everything about race? Well, from a historical perspective, the story of America is the story of the relationship between white, Black, and indigenous peoples. And until we have this ability to kind of have this conversation, I think what ends up happening in these conversations, even immediately about politics and what's political and what's moral and what's deemed acceptable to mention, what's not. I think if there'd be one move that I would like wish that we could start making in our language is to distinguish between partisan and political. Because that's often what the code is for in those in churches like that, where the piety kind of makes it so that you can't interrogate your partisanship. It's just what biblical values are. And the move I'm seeing a lot, because I've been watching sermons to try and get a better handle of this, and I have people send me stuff of like, hey, my pastor said this. And look, I am not out here to denigrate like clergy and pastors.
Sure.
If anything, I identify, like, I know what it's like. I know the demands of that office. I know the pressures. I also know the danger. And I stepped out because I could easily have seen myself in 20 years. Like, you put your head down long enough, you become someone you never planned on becoming.
Absolutely.
And so I say what I'm about to say, not that I'm about stirring up contempt, but that I'm about helping people know that they're not crazy. In so many ways. Like, that's who I'm speaking for and to. And so I get these sermons that are like, hey, I don't know what to do. This sound like a Trump rally at my church, but his name was never mentioned. And the move was this. It was, hey, we need to talk about politics today, but before we do that, we need to understand that, that the kingdom of God is encompasses the whole earth, every nation, every tribe, every tongue. And this is all like can be found in the Bible, right? But then there's always that but.
Right.
And the move was this. It was, there's no perfect candidate, but the left's agenda is demonic.
Yeah.
And what's really disheartening about that in two ways is having lived overseas, to hear Christians overseas express deep biblical concern over the refusal of conservatives in America to really reckon with climate change. And I know I just sound like a
Mm-hmm.
liberal activist talking about this, but I promise you, like, the theological reasons that is kind of undergirding everything I'm saying here. Like, I'm talking about
Yes.
Christians who would even identify as conservative in the UK,
Sure.
are just kind of perplexed as to the staunch even conspiratorial opposition to climate change for them is quote unquote biblical, right? So there's that overseas component, that you could easily code. If you're going to use the language of the demonic, you could easily code several aspects of quote unquote the rights platform as demonic. But the theological kind of current running deeper under there is that I don't think we are responsible as followers of Jesus Christ by using demonic language so flippantly, especially of our political, like, of the opposite of the partisan aisle.
Yeah.
And what we have is something that I think Karl Barth long identified is anytime you have a party who identifies itself as the Christian party, you have
Sure.
a party who's functioning as a church. And that's what, in so many ways, we've been unable to, in terms of white evangelicalism, have been unable to contend with. And I think this is where I think some bracing hope and almost optimism needs to come in, though, in that this optimism, though, is gritty and difficult. And I think what
That's right.
I'm about to suggest is not going to sound good to people, and sound, man, this guy's just like not very hopeful at all. But Bonhoeffer, who's a German theologian, talked about the difficulty of trying to talk with people under the sway of propaganda. And that's where we get this very famous line from him. And I'm kind of connecting this to our conversation about, like, not naming Trump, but like all of the coded slogans of biblical values, or even Jesus is Lord, have all been submerged and subsumed under an ascendant messianic candidate.
Yes.
And we're not really accustomed to using theological language, but like I'm opposing Trump because of his messianic claims.
Yes.
That's a Christian position.
Yeah.
And so Bonhoeffer had this statement of how difficult it is to deal with people and to converse with people who are under the sway of propaganda. And this one is really tweetable, and people say it all the time, that stupidity is a more dangerous than malice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what he said was, right on the heels of that, he goes, but nothing we despise in another is foreign to ourselves. Right. So isn't that such like a great, like, yeah. And then, oh man, like, got a nice uppercut in the John. Bonhoeffer's good like that. But what he said about that situation of stupidity, as it was kind of Hitler was making his way over the German masses, was that Bonhoeffer recognized that there needed to be an act of external liberation before the most fundamental internal liberation took place. Yeah. And I've thought about that for a really long time, and what it would mean for that kind of, and I think he was talking about regime collapse. I think he was talking about like the defeat, the political change that would bring about like a theological, like, oh, we committed gross acts of idolatry on the way to perpetuating evil. That I think when I think about the aftermath of what this election might hold, one of the things I've been prepared for is what the scripture tells us after Israel constructed the idol, was that Moses made him grind it up and drink it. Wow. And I think part of coming back to the States for me has been this willingness to accept whatever happens as we're going to have to drink this. Like, we are going to have to drink this as the church. And part of my work in January 6th is kind of to say, maybe the work of our generation for the next 40 to 50 years is cultivating hope in the ruins that we have, and being willing to drink that with people that maybe went head and over heels, and maybe we didn't, but in some ways owning it enough to know that we're all in some ways complicit, and that when one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. That's right. And so recognizing that if we really do believe that not just our fellow countrymen, but fellow brothers and sisters are caught up in gross political idolatry, and if the outcome of that privilege and power and that wielding of ascendant influence in America yields to like just us as the church having to drink this really bitter ground up cup of our idolatry, we might need to do that. and that might be that's the external liberation that Bonhoeffer promised. But we can do that as those who also bear witness to the power of the word to bring about internal liberation. And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
freeing, and that's also terrifying in the sense that
Yeah.
people ask me all the time, how do I convince my loved one who's, a really faithful, deeply faithful Christian who is basically at this point primed for the election conspiracy theories that are coming down the pipeline. And at this point, it's not a shrug of the shoulders. It's really just saying, like, are you prepared to suffer like the social outcome of this? And are you prepared to do so as one who is a witness to the hope that we could have chosen, the open doors to reconciliation that we could have taken, that now we found ourselves like having to deal with that. So that's a really heavy thought on the end of like that question about like, hey, talking about what is political versus what is moral, and not naming the name of Trump. I mean, in a very concrete sense, our political and social situation is priming us towards violence and priming us towards division. And I'm not here to maybe just suggest sentiment of like, hey, Jesus is calling us to the third way, to like stand in the middle. I think he is, and I think that's no man's land, and I think that's where most of the martyrs took their stand as witnesses.
It's a more dangerous place, not a safer one. It's not the middle of the road that is, I'm staying out. It's more like, no, you have to go deeper in.
Exactly.
More likely to get hurt, more likely to be. No, as haunting as it is, it's so, and Bonhoeffer right now in general is so clarifying and sanity restoring for me. But like that, 1,000% this kind of, can you drink the cup? Can we drink the cup? Because like, I am infinitely hopeful because of my faith in Jesus, but I am not particularly hopeful at all right now about this project in America, about evangelicalism, about even my Pentecostal charismatic world that I love on so many levels. So it's like there's a realism to that, and it doesn't feel romanticized anyway. But like, I think there is something of just drinking the cup. It's Jared, I'm not just saying this. I feel like I'm going to be bugging you. I wanted part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, because I feel like there's just so much I'd want to ask you about and to do. I mean, but the way you named it, I mean, I literally heard a sermon a few weeks ago in which a pastor simultaneously said, very much like, we don't do politics. I don't care if it's Democrat, Republican, straight into a riff of like, whatever you believe about this is how I went, I think. Whatever you believe about immigration, the economy, the environment, those things are political. Abortion and gay marriage are spiritual.
Yeah, right. Right.
And it was like a direct, after completely disclaiming there are no partisan politics here. But these two things are about good and evil, and they're doing evil, and you can't. So even if you disagree, I mean, it was just so overt. I mean, it was framed this way while actually actively insulating from any accusations of like, you're doing a right wing thing, you're doing a partisan. Oh, this has nothing to do with being a Republican. This has to do with being on the Lord's side. You know?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's like that. Here's what I've seen that is, if we want to get like the theological underpinning of this, and also something that is raging underneath conspiracy theory, is that all these, if people notice, and people know this, every conspiracy theory or plot always tells a bigger story about us versus them. There's always a them, and there's always an us. And even in that sermon, right, there is a them and there is an us. And here's where I think that's problematic theologically. Two things that are going on. Number one, it is way too easy in the bipartisan or the two-party system in America to code the parties in terms of eschatological categories. Yes, that's a whole lot. That's a theological word. So what I mean is just, it's a whole lot easier to look at one side as those destined for heaven and the other side is destined for hell. And conspiracy theories traffic on that too. It's a way of narrating the world by those categories of the saved and the damned. Here's where that's problematic. We don't get to decide that. Yeah. We don't get to preempt what God is going to do and how God's judgment is going to work itself out. That's right. And in that sense, I remain incredibly hopeful for reconciliation beyond what we could conceive.
Yes, me too.
And so it's one of those things where even in the political and social, we have to take great care. And I think this is where actually someplace where Christians, whether or not you're a leader or a pastor, or even if you're just concerned of like in disillusion, of like, how do I even think about this, let alone open my mouth. I think that's actually an opportunity for anyone who's kind of wants to take a step of responsibility to kind of call out like, hey, like we can't talk about other people as if they're going to hell and we're going to heaven.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the church's job. That's not how we get to narrate we have to narrate our world. And yet often case what's going on behind every political denouncement and the separation between, oh, this is moral and this is political, undergirding all of that is this prejudice of we are God's people and you are not.
That's
and
right.
Bonhoeffer has this, just great statement where he goes, we have to become obedient by becoming a sinner again. And that kind of dredges up this entire thing of like, we have to consider ourselves to be like the saved damned and the damned saved. And that's all bound up in Christ. Like that's just deeply, deeply, deeply Christian.
Yes.
But when you live in this, when you narrate the world by this idea that, when you use the New Testament spiritual warfare language to the neglect of its Christological witness, then you can really easily just imagine that your political opponents are demons. And there's a really good story of Karl Barth after the war, when the German church was really wrestling with its complicity, that he was in a room of German pastors and they started to kind of blame demons. They said, man, this was really demonic, everything that happened. And Barth interrupted them and said, maybe we were just political idiots.
Wow.
And he kind of, Barth's whole thing about the demonic is that the Christian position is to disbelieve in demons. It doesn't demythologize them. It doesn't say that, it still allows the scripture to be itself, and to be strange. But Barth's whole point was to be a Christian is to disbelieve in the power of sin, death, and evil.
Yes.
And the only evidence that we have of hell is that Jesus has triumphed over it.
Yeah.
And that kind of insight disrupts and destroys a lot of the very clear frameworks that we tend to code and project onto our political and social worlds.
That's right.
So I guess what I'm advocating for is in any way is for Christians to be more unsettled about the strangeness and the weirdness of our faith in ways that make it almost impossible to immediately apply it to politics. I think we need to be political. I think we need to be deeply political, but I don't think we understand how revolutionary and radical, and I'm going to say this and define it, how anarchical.
That's right.
And I mean, quite literally that word anarchy, meaning like against power. How that kind of Christian anarchy in the church can be a way of cultivating hope in the midst of ruins that we have to own publicly. The work of our generation, I think, in many ways, is going to be offering an apology for what has happened and for what we have participated in as church.
I believe it. And where confession is such an important practice, because it's like, we're the people who lead with that. Like and while we can't do, Howard Ross was such a mentor to me, but this idea that if you don't have a story, then like you don't have to start from a posture of repentance. If we just fell from heaven and the Bible dropped in our laps and we're not a particular people connected to a particular place or particular history, and we bear no responsibility for anything, then we don't have to start from a posture of repentance. But if we are the ones, if we are complicit, okay. Wanted to be mindful of your time, and this is so awesome. This happened with me pulling off the road in Rolla.
We're good.
This is so like, but no, also again, there's so much I'd want to be able to do. This is all landing on so many levels. I want to make sure I was able to ask you though, because just in terms of, and I love even landing with this. This is not that version of centrism or being in the middle where it's like, oh, we're staying out. No, this is a call to a much more vulnerable, and maybe it does get harder. Maybe it just does get worse. Maybe there's and bearing some of the approach in this way. But I'm thinking about like how for so many folks now, I think there's a very practical, like, okay, when I read an article, when I hear a sermon, when I see any kind of a claim, if it's not something in my field of study, if it's not something I'm deeply informed on, how do I know, what does discernment look like with the vast amount of information we're taking into our heads? Like, are there any handles you could give for folks in terms of like kind of on a ground level, how to think more discernibly about all of this with regards to really just how we take in almost anything.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is do like reflect on, but also explore the ways that digital infrastructure, like our use of technology, shapes our brains. So I'm a theologian. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a psychologist. Um, and those disciplines have a lot to say about conspiracy theory. And so what I would suggest is doing some research and exploring. One good book that actually gets to. I'm gonna make 3 book recommendations on this question.
Please.
The first is it's by Jeffrey Bilbro, Bil Bill Bro, Jeffrey Bilbro. And the subtitle is like a theological inquiry into the news. I think it's called Reading the Times, and it's just a theological reflection on media and the art of news. So that's a good one. The next one is kind of where the concept of digital infrastructure, what I use to describe, it's called the surveillance capitalism by a scholar, Zubridov. And this is an older book. I think it's like from 2014, but it just depicts the rise and then the evolution of Google and now Twitter and Musk and Thiel, and these kind of rogue barons. It kind of describes the profit logics that are operating in how we use these machines. So there's that. And then from a very practical standpoint, there's Cal Newport has a book called Digital Minimalism that is kind of in the vein of like self-help, that he's going to give you the tools to kind of build a life, and reflect on that. He's based here in DC. But he also describes the design of digital platforms, which is really helpful. And so I would reflect on the ways that technology shapes us, and here's a way to resist that. So doing that reflection, but I'll tell you, one of the ways that we are being shaped is our ability and capacity to digest long form. And this is pretty obvious to some people, but like long form information, we are getting really bad at this. And so one of the ways that we protect ourselves and we resist, is by long form reading, like by sitting with and reading over time. And let me be the theologian here and suggest that being given a book that is a theological library that comprises like 5,000 years of ongoing back and forth conversation about the God of Israel, is a really, really necessary book, a really, really necessary library that can actually stay us and can actually give us some grounds to stand on, because you're not just and this is hard for fundamentalists and evangelicals, and Pentecostals, I think, into some respects too, because we've all inherited this idea that, Justin Welby described it this way, that the cultural canopy of Christendom has been shattered. And now our cultural landscape is littered, he says, with shards from this canopy. And what happens is pastors, leaders, they pick up these shards and wield them against their opponents. So I'm talking about like, a verse here, a verse here, a statement there. So they become shards or shibboleths. They attract followers and they defend yourself against enemies. And I think that really just highlights for me, getting back to this kind of, we're talking about media literacy and our inability to sit with things over a long time. The return to like liturgy and daily office is not just a trend. I think it's something that reflects a resistance to the way that our media ecosystem is operating. So I would leave people with that. And hopefully it's I'll tell you, some of my disillusionment, I could not read the Bible at length for a very long time. And so I understand, like, inviting people to go back to the Bible might be a very challenging ask. And so with that being said, like, find a good theologian then. I mean, find your way back into that world where the Bible can become mysterious and strange and reflect the diversity of voices that have poured into it. That was not the Bible that I was told exists. But since knowing the difference between, how I've been taught about it and versus what it can be and what it was in Israel's hands, I think is definitely a different story entirely.
So helpful. I can't tell how much I feel like this conversation is not just standard restoring, but I think is life saving for so many of us right now who are looking for any kind of handles or just,
Yeah.
and everybody I talk to almost, because the sense, even when we're talking about long form reading, people are like, well, I'm not good at that anymore. That doesn't come naturally, as if it's a glitch in the matrix. Like, oh no, this is all of us. We're all rewiring our brains, and
Yep.
this is where this is. It's not easy for anybody, but to immerse ourselves in that way, I feel like it's so restorative for me right now. I want to make sure I ask you. This is the smallest question. I'll end with the
Okay.
smallest question, but I know there's strategy here, and it's. I thought this is like I legitimately just don't know because I'm not as conversant in the field. I've noticed specifically that, like online, anything that you'll post about misinformation, disinformation, you'll consistently use more like asterisk and things like that.
Yep.
I'm sure there's a thoughtful reason, and I'm like, I need to make sure I ask Jared what that's about, and if that's a practice that I might need to consider as I'm trying to be more conversant in this conversation.
Yeah, I think so. I've started using asterisks for my eyes on conspiracy theory, disinformation, etc. That's not because I think that platforms are canceling it. Like X is amplifying it,
right?
But it's not going by the name conspiracy theory. So basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure the algorithm like kind of looks at it and says, okay, he's not advocating, or I'm concerned that my activism against disinformation and conspiracy theory would contribute to more of the problem. And so,
right.
Like,
wow. Yeah.
I'm trying to basically not give the algorithm any reason to send me into like a rabbit hole echo chamber where, like, if you want to talk about conspiracy theories, you can be sorted into there. So I'm trying to prevent myself from being sorted. And on the other hand, like, I'm trying to prevent, what's the word? The incendiary nature. I'm trying to avoid the incendiary. Like, I'm not on social media to go back and forth about conspiracy theory.
Nope, me neither.
So like, I'm trying to like not scream out into the void, to address people who think that this is a serious issue, who are grappling with it themselves. And I'm trying to do that in a way that the algorithm doesn't sort my stuff into one or two of those camps, where either like I'm mocking disinformation as some sort of that's not a real thing, or that I'm, in some cases just being political, because I think some accounts like Instagram and things like that are sorting people based on perceived political content. So I'm just trying to be wise with the algorithm and recognizing that words and even in images can be read and coded and sorted. So I think 100 years from now, historians are going to have a lot of work to do in figuring out how the works that we produced and the books that we decided to make and sell and the ideas that we had were sorted and coded by this algorithm. They will be talking about like algorithmically conditioned church movement theologies. I mean, that's they're gonna figure out a way with all that data. They're gonna have a lot of work on their hands.
I so believe it. In my little riff the other day, I keep wanting to do more with this. There's like, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against algorithms. It feels like that. It's like, well, it's this is so dominant in terms of how it shapes our reality. Jared, I cannot thank you. I'm not to speak with hyperbole. This is literally what I feel like, the things that you're putting out there and even having this conversation today. I feel like it's like, I feel like, as a person who, like, I think everyone is somewhat soul sick from all the time. I feel like this has been about an hour and 15 minutes of, I got hooked up to an IV. I got some other stuff into my system. I feel like, oh wait, I can breathe. I think I'm not gonna die today. I think like, just like oxygen clarity. I feel like it's like that. It almost feels like like medical help, mental health, like that kind of thing. Just some sanity, some clarity, the way that you name things. So I just thank you for that good and healing work that you're doing. I think it's absolutely essential. And and it's the reason it wasn't really because of the podcast. This is not for promotional purposes. The reason I've been kind of retweeting everything of yours on like Twitter, Threads, etc., is more like the sense of like, no, this is the kind of, again, sanity restoring, soul cleansing thing that I need in my life. And if there's anything I'd want to share with my friends right now, it's like, this is the stuff that's bringing life to my own soul. So thank you for doing this
I appreciate
difficult work, being in the trenches of the thing, because I just think it matters so much.
Well, and I think from my point, I mean, I think that's really encouraging, and thank you for sharing that. I think it's probably on me to reference when I moved to Scotland, like my supervisor, some theological colleagues of mine were the IV for me. Right. So like,
yeah,
I reference that not to just like kind of get a sentimental, like, oh yeah, no, me too. But the ministry of You're Not Crazy. Is it takes all of us, and the ability to kind of pat each other on the back and say like, no, you're we can keep going. That the seemingly like cultural collapse and the tearing of our social fabric, which can make us want to join in that retribution and cycles of violence. There's a real opportunity here, once again, for the church to remind itself who we are. And so I'm thrilled to hear that, and I'm greatly indebted to people who I remember. I'll just tell this story and we can be done. But I delivered a paper early on in my work, and I was just kind of riffing on the church in the sense that ever since Constantine, there's the church has been all enmeshed in power, and it was blistering. And I still agree with a lot of it. But I had a colleague who raised her hand and she goes, "I'm afraid if you keep going down this route, you're not going to have anything left." And I sat with that for so long, and I recognized that's when this turn in my research began to turn. But I couldn't get there because the theological resources that I was given from white evangelicalism didn't allow me to say anything else. And so for me, it became a real place of finding theologies that came up from beneath America and outside of America that have gone through cultural collapse, that have emerged out of crisis, that was like, well, look, whatever was coming, we're going to have to drink it. But there's always going to be hope in the midst of exile and ruins. And I'm thrilled that was the case. And on that front, I do have a lot more coming. I hopefully have an announcement about a book at some point. I'm like right on the verge of being able to kind of talk more about that. So those things are coming. Of course, people can find me too on Instagram and Threads and all the other places.
And your handle, those places, so they can.
So Instagram and Threads is Jared M. Stacy, and X is Jared Stacy. And so I'm always, if people want to reach out and kind of say, hey, like, I need help about this question. Like, again, I'm that active. I may not be able to get to it immediately, but I want to be able to facilitate that kind of conversation. So I want to welcome that from people who hear it.
It's such good work. And whenever you're ready to talk about the book, that's exciting to me that's coming. I certainly want to do that. I tell you what, for all the ambiguity I have about pastoral work in America, in my context right now, I have no ambiguity about the ministry of You're Not Crazy. I aspire to that. Sign me up for the ministry of You're Not Crazy, to receive it, to give it if I can. Like, that is like, I am all the way in.
That's right. We need
crazy. That's so good.
We need it, man.
Thank you, Jared. This is awesome. So appreciate you, friend.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So good. That's hilarious. I've got a little note.